Welcome to Add It to the List, a podcast where we binge watch the first season of an anime and then talk about whether it should go on your watch list. I'm Jack, and with me as always is...
Forrest.
And we're just a couple of guys who have been friends for a little bit, and in the way that white people do, figured that we should talk about anime on the internet. Beware spoilers for the first season of this week's show, The Ranking of Kings. Also beware trigger warnings for quite a lot of violence and some child abuse. Forrest, what did you know about Ranking of Kings going into this?
I knew it existed, but I had not... I guess I'd been wanting to watch it, honestly, ever since it came out, because I just kept hearing great things about it, and it definitely didn't disappoint.
Yeah, I think I saw, a Crunchyroll short on YouTube or something like that, to the point where its name was in my memory, but I couldn't think of what it was. Honestly, I am glad that we sat down with it. Not at all what I was expecting.
Yeah, honestly, I was 100% blind, which, is what I'm going to try to do most of the time with our shows that we watch. But, obviously, until we decide to watch one that either one of us has seen or both of us have seen.
Alrighty. According to Crunchyroll, Ranking of Kings, under more information, how prosperous your nation is, how many powerful warriors it boasts, and how heroic and strong its king is. These are the criteria that factor into the system known as the Ranking of Kings. The main character, Boji, was born the first prince of the kingdom ruled by King Basu, who is ranked number 7 in the Ranking of Kings. But Boji was born unable to hear, and is so powerless that he can't even swing a sword. In consequence, not only his own retainers, but also the public, look down upon him as completely unfit to be king. It is then that Boji finds his first friend, Kage. His fateful encounter with Kage ignites a tiny spark of courage, and Boji's life takes a dramatic turn. All of those things are true, Crunchyroll. None of those things I would say is fundamental to the experience of this show.
Yeah, not in the least bit. And also the thing about Kage being the thing that gave him a spark, I guess is kind of true, but I feel like Kage more so accepted Boji. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, the courage, it's weird. So this is the period of the show where we're going to be a spoiler light, but still spoilery. You kind of can't have the sort of nature of one of these shows without spoilers.
It's not going to be heavy spoilers until the later half of the show.
In general, I enjoyed this show quite a bit. I do not think that summary explains the vibe, the plot, or honestly even that moment that they were talking about, the meeting between Kage and Boji, particularly well.
I think that first that literally only talks about the first episode.
Yep. Yeah, it's weird. When we did our Angel Beats episode, Google's overview was a very good, concise summary. Looking around for one of those for Angel or for Ranking of Kings, I could not find one. This is not a particularly complicated show to summarize, but for whatever reason, just nothing really was endemic of it.
That honestly might be a good thing, though, because I think this show is so good if you don't know what to expect. I don't know. This show has so much depth to it.
Yeah, it's very good. Broad strokes, like Crunchyroll said, there is the Ranking of Kings. It's done by this sort of third-party faction. They're not really necessarily connected to any particular kingdom. They're also, spoiler alerts, not really that important in the story that we are told. In the larger world, the implication of them being there, they are quite important. As far as the story that we witness, they're more or less just sort of the MacGuffin, the idea of becoming the number 1 ranked king.
Which is interesting because that's not even really Boji's dream per se. I think Boji wanted to be king in a sense, but it is The ranking of kings concept, I think, is something that the writer clearly like wanted to introduce to the later parts of the story. That's actually something that I did. I mean, I didn't know it until I was watching it, but I looked up the series, and apparently this first season covers 159 chapters of the manga.
Oh.
And there's 191 chapters in the manga. So this is honestly really far into the series, and I definitely think they set it up at the end. They set it up for like a possible second season, but I'm sure that I think the world building and like branching out into the wider world is what will be the focus of the series going forward.
You know, I didn't look into whether or not there was a manga. It makes sense that there was, because that's more the rule rather than the exception. But that feels right. I very much felt a very rushed storytelling pace, especially towards the end. At first, I just thought things were clipping along. Like, a lot happens in not a lot of time. I guess broad strokes. We follow this young prince named Boji. We don't know how old he is, but he's sub 6, sub 5 maybe. I mean, actually, that's probably not true. He's sub puberty.
I mean, that is actually a long conversation to have.
There's a lot to that.
Because I have researched the shit out of that in particular because I wanted to know how old Boji was supposed to be. And the series itself never states how old he is, but he's supposed to be in his late teens.
No. Wrong.
No, he is. He's supposed to be at least older than 14.
Really?
Because he's the older brother to Daida.
Right.
And Daida, I feel like, is only like 10 or 11 or 12.
This shows... I think part of the reason why Forrest and I can't nail that, or I suppose the community at large can't nail that down, is the animation style of this show. Is they both Boji and his younger but more competent brother, Prince Daida, I put Daida at like 8. So maybe in my mind, Boji's like about 10 or 12, because we see a young enough to not have all of his teeth, or at least still be losing baby teeth.
Yeah.
Boji in flashbacks of freshly swaddled Daida. So I guess that's why I pictured them pre-puberty. But that's kind of the point for Boji. Very minor, like episode 3 out of 23 spoilers. Boji is baby. Boji is baby. Because of a demon curse. It's not important at this point who cursed him or why, although that is pretty much the crux of the show.
I mean, going into that aspect of Boji's character, I do think the overarching aspect of his character is that he's not accepted by people. Or people accept him, but people also look down on him because they don't think he's fully capable. I think that the author clearly did that on purpose, like kind of made his age weirdly ambiguous, because you're supposed to think he's a child, you know, and I feel like as the story goes on, you learn that he is significantly more capable than people let on, and I think that that's kind of, it's almost supposed to be a misdirection, because the way that you think he's really, really young ends up just kind of not being the case, I think. And like, people treat him so young because of his stature, because of his inability to hear. People don't think he's strong in a fight, but you know, all of those things get disproven. And I think that that's kind of the sole purpose of his age being so ambiguous, is so that you can, you know, kind of learn that. And that's also a large part of his development as a character, and also just the development of all the characters around him.
Yeah. I suppose at this point, A broad broad strokes overview of the show. We follow Prince Boji, who is the firstborn son of a kingdom that's doing pretty well. King Boss, or Bossu, as Crunchyroll put it in the review, but it's subtitled Bosse.
I mean, I definitely think it's just boss. Like,
I
that's how
also
they
definitely
pronounce
think
it.
it's just Boss, but Bossu is how Crunchyroll decided to
I
write
mean,
it
that's
down
if
for
you're
whatever
saying
reason.
it in Japanese, but we're not Japanese, so I think we can just call him boss.
But so yes, I agree. But what's funny to me is even in the show they just call him Boss. They don't call him Bossu. Like the voice actors don't say Bossu. They say Boss.
I mean, that's because in Japanese, like that su sound at the end oftentimes can just become that s, like des. You know, sometimes people pronounce it desu because it's desu. So boss's name is probably su at the end. So like from a Japanese perspective, that would just flow, and they would just say boss. They wouldn't go basu because that's a very like improper thing in a way.
Between
Anyway, my
Forrest,
weeb is coming forward.
you see, Forrest is the weeb who took Japanese in college. I am not. Honestly, that was super interesting, and I really enjoyed learning that. But the thing that like is why I'm not sure which one it is because the subtitles during the episode ended it with an E and not a U. I was just making fun of Crunchyroll for not having internal consistency is all I was doing.
Yeah.
Boss is a giant who had Boji with, we learn in like episode 3, very minor spoiler. Boji is his son with his first wife, a fellow giant. I forget her name. I think we learn it twice, but she's dead by the time the series starts because Boss is married to his second wife, Hilla, who I love. I love her a bunch. Kage, the best friend boy, refers to her as, quote, hysterical brick house old biddy.
Well, isn't her name Hyling?
It's like Hyling. They call her Hilla. I think there's Hyling, but for whatever reason, I just started thinking of her as Hilla. It could just be because I'm bad at names.
I mean, that's totally fine. We can call her whatever we want, but
Brick house old biddy.
Hyla or Hilla or Hilling, however we end up pronouncing it, is the queen, the current queen.
Yeah. And also mother of Prince Daida. Boji's younger, but much more competent brother. We then learn that part of the reason why Boji's deaf and mute, I mean, I guess it's technically deaf and dumb, but I'm nowhere near qualified to talk about the ableism there or how people who are unable to form words but are able to vocalize like to be addressed. That's not for me to say, but that's his whole setup.
Yeah, I'd be interested to hear like actual opinions, you know, from people that are deaf about like the depiction of a deaf character, because I don't think it's done poorly in any sense. But a large, you know, aspect is that since Boji is deaf, he just can't speak because he can't hear himself talk. And I as far as I understand, that's fairly true. I think that early on is especially meant to show him being, you know, not fully capable because people don't think he can speak. And I think that that's a lot of what the story is trying to present early on so that it can kind of, you know, subvert your expectations by like, you know, making him much more capable.
Yeah. So yeah, Boji can't hear, he can't speak, and he can't swing a sword. He's a very weak little boy. We see him struggling with some pretty basic things. He's also like maybe 1.5 feet. That's more of a visual thing than it is a comment of his height, although he is noticeably shorter than his younger brother. The animation style is very beautiful. It's very reminiscent of a hand-drawn style, but it's also very cartoony. In a way that undermines how violent the show is. Oh my lord! It's an adorable little show, but some messed up stuff happens to people.
the art style is incredible though. I think it really it kind of brings to the table something similar to One Piece, but in a really, I mean, honestly, I almost feel like it does a better job than One Piece in that sense, because all of the character designs are like outstanding, and it has this like simplicity to it that offers a lot in terms of just what can be done in the artistic sense. And I also almost feel like that's part of why it worked so well in animation, because it really, I wouldn't say it feels like Western animation, but like it's just so unique that it brings this like kind of medieval fantasy world to life, that's kind of reminiscent of a lot of like
early Disney, like Snow White era Disney
yeah,
almost.
yeah, early Disney, or just even just early high fantasy in general, just dragons and knights and giants,
Yeah.
like that kind of stuff.
Yeah, it's a very interesting, beautiful art style. It does belay some of the seriousness of the events that we are witness to. But anyway, that's all to say that Boji is sort of a mystery because of how stylized he is. And his brother. But we also only really interact with those two as not adults. Everyone else is an adult, so we don't really have a frame of reference for what a teenager looks like or what a 9-year-old looks like. We have some village children in episode 1 who are like, hey, what's going on? And like start making fun of Boji because they don't think he can understand them. And also they're kids, and kids are universally awful, so they would not necessarily withhold pointing out that Boji is definitely abled. But he is shorter than them, and they are drawn in a way that they look like less than 3, less than 4. So, I don't know. So Boji, of undeterminate but definitely not particularly highly thought of ability and capability, is set to be the next king, insofar as he's the oldest. But in episode 1, we see nobody believing in him. We hear his main retainers and his stepmom talk about how he is not fit to be the king. This matters because Boss, the current king, we are introduced to as a very sickly person. He's still a giant. Not in an anime, oh my god, that guy's so tall, but literally it's established that he's from a race of giants. And he's still an imposing enough figure, but we see him in bed, we see him coughing up blood. Pretty early on, we get a scene where he calls everybody into his chamber and he names Boji as king. Well, we've already established very few people believe in him. So, all of the more important retainers and the queen vote to have Daida become the king once Boss dies. And that sort of instigates our first arc. I say arc. It's one 23 episode anime at this point. So it's really just one arc. But our first, plot point is that Prince Daida is installed as king against the old king's wishes. And at this point, Boji is convinced that everybody is against him. Up to and including our little Kage. I would like to stop here and talk about Kage, because Kage raises some very weird questions about the world.
Yeah. I mean, I think we can also use this as our avenue for just talking about character writing in general. Because, dude, the character writing in this show, I think, is outstanding. And, I don't say that often, but, I think some of the best character writing I've ever read is, Vinland Saga. And I think this is easily on par with what Vinland Saga does with its characters. And it even does them in a much different way, but it's so seamless, and every character is just so complex in, a good way. I don't know, dude. It's so good. And yeah, we can talk about Kage first, because Kage is basically the first character we're introduced to outside of Boji.
So I will say I agree into a point. I think a lot of characters aren't given enough time to do anything, so we don't really know who most of the cast is. And there are some members of the cast that are super interesting and super deep, and then just sort of become one note for like the last 12 episodes. I do think a lot of their arcs aren't paced very well.
I think I'm gonna disagree with you on that, but we will talk about
We
that.
can talk about them by name in a second here.
Yeah.
So Kage is the last, but not confirmed. He is what we are to understand is the last member of the Shadow Clan. And that's not like a racism against real life people of darker skin thing. He's literally an ink blot shadow that scooches across the ground. It's not particularly well established what the Shadow Clan were, but we're introduced to them as a sort of clan of assassins and murderers and spies because they're little ink blots that can hide in the shadow. And apparently that's just a thing that they did. That's how they earned their living. Well, turns out being the clan of assassins gets you murked sooner or later.
I think that was I did feel like that was really well written in the way that I didn't feel like people just hated the Shadow Clan because of their appearance, which was kind of a nice change of pace. You know, like there were a lot of moments where I felt like people were just okay with it, you know, like Kage would roll around and people would be like, "Yeah, get away." Like they didn't care that he was around. It wasn't like they were like, "Oh my god, that's a Shadow Clan person." I mean, occasionally that would happen, but it was only because of the reputation of the Shadow Clan being assassins, you know, and that's fair. Like when there's a reputation of a race that literally is just all assassins, of course there's going to be animosity towards them. But I also think that they do a good enough job of presenting them as a people that already exist and have existed in this world.
Yeah, I think the point that I was going to make is that Kage and the Shadow Clan are a weird instance because they are definitely not human. They are literally puddles of shadow. But they're not monsters. And we know that enough because monsters exist in this world, and they weren't considered monsters. They were only ever referred to as the Shadow Clan. Race is real in this show. There's Gigantics, or whatever Gigan is. Gigan's a character that honestly doesn't matter. He's vaguely important for 2 episodes, and he comes along later.
I mean, I think that his race was kind of like the underworld race. They were like essentially the orcs of this world. I
Yes,
felt like.
big green-skinned boys, but big. Like, if it wasn't for the fact that Boss's race was already established as to be giants, I feel like Gigan would just be an orc giant. My thing about Kage is that a weird sort of dynamic with what people just accept as sapience, because we don't have much exposure to a lot of non-human humans. It's pretty much just Gigan and Kage. And then there are other monsters in some antagonistic orcs, but not orcs in the way that Gigan is giant and green, but just like human-sized green people. It's a background aspect which makes the world feel more dynamic because really we don't spend that much time outside of Boji's kingdom. But it does raise questions as to just the environment and ecology of the world. It's something that stuck with me quite substantially, honestly, because the Shadow Clan were literally shadow, like 2D shadow smears with eyes and hands.
Very like, I don't even know how you would describe it other than like, I felt like Boji and Kage were kind of like mascot characters in a way.
Yes.
Like looking at the art style of the manga, it looks like a 60s, 70s manga, like on purpose, I think. And you bringing up the aspect of like how the like introduction of Kage's race kind of just like raises all these questions about just like the world and like what exists in the world. that's one of the things that I loved about this show, because I didn't feel like world building was front and center, because it didn't need to be, but like one of my favorite things in world building is when the story kind of gives you little tidbits here and there of what exists in this world, and like these mysteries that may or may not be answered, but things that really make you feel the vastness of the world that you're in fiction. And I mean, I will always stand by that. That is one of the best parts about One Piece. But this show brought that out for me. And honestly, the first time, I think, since One Piece. Just like the way a couple instances are like Boji and a couple of his retainers are like just traveling, and Boji like stumbles upon this old man, and the old man like is a hunter, but then you see this giant like shadow glob that's just like floating in the air, and it's just like sucking up all the souls of dead animals and then spitting out brand new animals to like populate the forest. And this guy like explains it all, but you're like, wait, this is just something that exists? Like, it just is thrown out there, and you know, it's thrown out there with such confidence that like it just raises more questions, but like not in a bad way. Like, it just makes you more curious about the world because it opens up so many possibilities. And then not long after that, you just get to see the gate to the underworld, and you're like, so there's just an underworld too? You know, it's like these little bits of world building that just like blow the world open. And like, I don't think that they need to be explained, but it's things like that that just make the world feel that much fuller.
So I will say, I agree that the world feels huge. I, however, think that the fact that some of these very key aspects, like the fact that there's an underworld that is populated by normal human-looking people and also orcs and also all of these other background monsters, and that's separate from hell. There's also, like, magical portal ways of getting there, but there's also just, like, a geographical location that's the underworld. It is enough to get me curious, but not enough to make me feel satisfied like I understand how the world works.
I mean, I don't think it needs to make you feel like you understand how it works. That's kind of what I was getting at. Because, like, I mean, and this could easily just be a personal thing for me, but I just love that style of world building because it leaves so much open, and you don't have to explain it all, but it just makes the world feel that much more lived in, you know? It's kind of what the Dark Souls games do too, you know? It's kind of like just showing without telling you. And I know you're laughing because I always talk about these things, but it's true. It's the reasons that I like these pieces of fiction, you know? And the Ranking of Kings is like the first time in a long time that like that has just been like so present for me.
I mean, so the point that I was going to make is that it is a your mileage may vary thing. I felt wanting more in a way that was unsatisfying, but that's because the way that I work is I want to know the rules of the world. I want to be shown, and I enjoy when it happens hand in hand with the story. I want to be shown if religion's right. I want to be shown how magic works, those sorts of things. I want to know the rules of the world that we live in. We never learn the rules of the world that we live in. Forrest is here for that. I get frustrated by that. Your mileage may vary.
But I kind of disagree that we don't learn how the world works, because like I also think that there's a lot of things that the story clearly is going to delve into later down the line. Because I do feel like this first season is very much a story about Boji. And I think it'll continue to be a story about Boji, but like this is kind of, in a weird way, this feels like the introductory arc to this show.
To be sure, this feels like the first arc of a shonen. Insofar as we're introduced to a lot, we're explained a little, and we end in a position to explore more without spoiling anything.
Yeah, so I mean, there's definitely things you can improve upon, but I was just blown away at just like the way that the world felt so massive, without much effort. Because I feel like sometimes worlds can just feel so shallow. Take, for instance, like Dragon Ball's world. Like, it just doesn't feel like there's much there until you get into the cosmic level. So it's like, yeah, I just think it takes a lot of skill to create a world that you can leave so much open in.
Well, the funny thing is I don't even think we disagree on that point. I also feel like this is a big world, but I am left frustrated at the end of season 1 that I don't understand things. And the way that it's shaping up is the things that I don't understand that are frustrating to me, I don't think are going to be explored.
Well, what are some of those things that are frustrating?
What is the underworld? Is hell real? Are monsters sapient? Are all monsters sapient? Are some monsters sapient? Are like monsters that are like those orcs that aren't quite the giants that are Gigan's race? Are they just sort of green people who just so happen to live in a geographical location that we have established to be the underworld? But also the underworld is ran by normal, like, surface world humans. That's what the royal family of the underworld is. What is all of that? I don't think we're going to get those answers. Whether or not we need those answers, that's not what I'm talking about. But I personally, because we are discussing season 1,
well, that's what
felt unsatisfied. And that's fine. The only thing I was going to say at the start of this is your mileage may vary with that.
Yeah.
There is a lot to this show. If you're the sort of person that gets hung up on detail, you might not enjoy how the story is told.
I think we definitely got sidetracked from talking about characters.
I was going to make the same point. Kage is from the Shadow Clan, which is where this all started. Kage, I do not think, is a very well-rounded character. Kage is best friend boy, and minor spoilers, very minor. We learn all this in like episode 3, episode 4. The Shadow Clan was genocided. There's no real easy way of putting that. They were exterminated as a clan of little inkblot shadow people because they were hired as assassins because they were good at it. But what's vaguely presented as like a corrupt government official frames them for a murder and uses that as an excuse to wipe them all out. Kage watches his mom die as she's making room for him to escape. And then he goes to a neighboring kingdom where they don't have the same prejudice against the Shadow Clan, but they are still wary of him and they do neglect him as just another street urchin. And then he gets taken advantage of by this bad person, and then Kage's left with no one after that person's badness catches up with them. And so Kage just sort of roams around as like a bandit, and he meets Boji and basically mugs him. But Boji doesn't have money, so he gives him clothes, and this is all episode 1. So Boji's walking through the streets back home in his undies. But then he comes back the next day. And he comes back the next day because for whatever reason, and the show refuses to acknowledge why, the show tells you across multiple times to just accept it because this is the premise. And that's fine. Like, it wasn't too distracting. It did get annoying, but it wasn't too distracting. The show says, for whatever reason, Kage can understand Boji. Remember, Boji is nonverbal. At the very least, he is not capable of forming words in the language that everybody else is speaking. He babbles. In the same way that we would say that, like, a baby babbles. For whatever reason, Kage can understand him. Kage himself says he doesn't know why. The show's just like, this is the premise, buy into it.
That's, like, so easy for me to overlook, I feel like. Because I think that Kage and Boji's relationship is so integral, mostly because Boji can understand Kage too. Like it,
Well,
I
Boji
think
can
you
read
could,
lips.
You can make the same argument that, oh, how can Boji read Kage's lips because he doesn't even have lips? He literally just has a weird mouth thing that moves up and down. Like, it doesn't like form, the sounds that you have to see to read lips. So like, those are things that I think you just kind of have. Like, it is one of the few things where I think it's just like suspension of disbelief, which like
Yeah,
isn't.
it's your buy-in. It
Yeah.
is. This is a level you have to buy into to watch this show. Like I said, it's episode 1. You buy into it. It's not distracting. The reason why I say that it's annoying, though, is because it makes most of Boji's dialogue throughout the series take twice as long. Because Boji babbles and then Kage translates.
Yeah, that is kind of an issue. You were gonna say that Kage is not a very well-rounded character. Is that what you said? Because I definitely don't agree with that.
I don't think most characters in this show have that much depth. They're very fun characters, and they're characters that I enjoy, but I do not think most characters have that much depth. I also think most characters have a lot going on, but the substance of who they are, as far as how they interact with the story and their one-liners go, isn't that much. I'm going to stop here if I can. And this goes back to what I was saying about the cutesiness of the art style undermining the real gory violence. This shows strangely in-between tones for me. Because on the one hand, it's very serious, it's very dark. But then on the other hand, it's very adorable, and it's very much trying to be a comedy, and it very much has aspects of a comedy anime. The art style is reminiscent of what I was Googling earlier, which is Cyborg 009, which is a show I remember from a kid. I do not remember anything about it. If that reference means anything to you, you know exactly how this show looks, basically. Specifically, the new queen and also Daida have the nose of Android 007. It's real pointy. There are real espionage, world-shattering betrayal, Game of Thrones style secrets, and like nobody knows anybody else's intention, and that's really interesting. But there are also, like, after 2 or 3 scenes, this character we only ever see crying in a comedy way, right? Like, it has a dichotomy within characters that I don't think serves anybody particularly well.
Wait, what character?
A couple of them. The guy, the retainer who's Boji's swordmaster. Domas. There are 2. Okay. Before we continue. Everybody who's important either has a B name or a D name, and it's obnoxious. There's Domas, there's Dorsha, there's Daida, there's Boji, there's Boss.
But then there's a piece, and then
a piece doesn't.
Then
matter.
There is Bebin. What do you mean
Bebin.
A piece doesn't matter?
A piece doesn't matter,
dude. We have so many different opinions on the characters in this show because I love every character and the way that they are written.
I like Bebin. Dorsh is my boy. I would die for Dorsh.
I think they are so well rounded. Like. I
disagree. I think everybody has secrets, and they are 3-dimensional insofar as they are hiding things from other people. But I think the character that we interact with doesn't have that much depth to them.
But I mean, we learn pretty much why every character feels the way that they do, and I feel like that's the depth that we need, because like the decisions they make are informed by their pasts and like the reasons they went through the things that they did. Like, I feel like that's the reason it's done so well, is because every character, we do learn most of their pasts, and when we learn those things, it gives us so much more information about their motivations and why they do what they did. But, like, also there's characters that do things that you would initially feel like, subvert or counteract their past, but then I feel like you're revealed to the reasons they did those things anyway. And like it offers this complexity to each character that I feel like most fiction just doesn't even try to approach.
I agree and disagree at the same time. So yes, everybody who does unsuspected things their actions are justified and we find out why. And those parts are interesting. As far as the three-dimensionality of those characters are concerned, we're introduced to characters as good guys who are in our side. They do one thing that throws that into question, and the degree of that question is different. Some of them are just like, oh, you just disappeared for a couple of episodes. Wow, what an asshole. And some of those are, wow, you're super betraying me right now. But then, a couple of episodes later, we figure out why, and then for the rest of the show, we know 100% their motivations, and we know exactly what they're going to do next. There is a degree of transparency, I think, is what we're talking about. We know the characters and we know why they're doing what they're doing. We find that out after they do the initially shocking thing, but nobody feels like they live in the world. Everybody feels like they are there for the plot, and the plot's not that okay. The story is very complicated. The plot's not that complicated. This show, okay. Let's just throw all structure out the window and skip to add it to the list. Because...
No, I think we can still talk about characters.
I can't.
Why not?
I can't,
because you have to talk about the plot?
The characters exist within confines of the plot that exists within spoilers.
I mean, I guess. I think we can talk about how we feel about the writing of the characters.
Fine.
I mean,
good, bad in that... Okay. Everybody's either fine, good, or bad. Most characters are at one point at different points insofar as who their character are. They're very much presented as plot points, and then they're presented as people, and then they're presented as people who are just sort of around. And the order in which they are presented as one of those things is different. So, for example, there's an evil mirror. They become, in my opinion, way too important.
I don't know about that. But yeah, we can just talk about it if we had added it to the list.
Add it to the list just so that we can talk about spoilers, because I need to explain the spoilers to explain my point.
I think we're far enough in that this is a good moment to do that.
This is a dramatically different episode than our one for Angel Beats. I imagine we posted that first because this is probably not a good way for us to just first episode it. This is a dramatically different format, and I think it's because we both feel much stronger about this show. And this is how you know we don't talk about this beforehand.
But that's the point of this podcast.
So
Jack,
Oh, no, go ahead.
Jack, would you add this to the list?
Yes. Okay. And I waited because I wanted to see whether or not you were surprised. I like this show up until episode 18 through 23.
Really, I like this show all the way through episode 20.
I think this show is at its strongest in the first 6 episodes because after that, it hard pivots. I really enjoyed this show. The ending felt rushed and like so much exposition was happening and not a lot of time. I would add it to the list though because it's a good experience. Episode 1 legitimately made me think I'd hate this show. Because episode 1 is Boji babbling, Kage explaining it to us, and then just scenes of Boji being a good boy. And don't get me wrong, I love Boji. I would kill for episode 1 Boji if it would make him happy. But I was very much expecting to be annoyed by this show. And then episodes 2 through 6 happens, and I'm like, oh my god, I'm watching anime Game of Thrones. I cannot handle this. Emotionally, I do not have the resources for this. And then more of the supernatural aspects start getting explained. And I'm like, oh, this isn't interesting anymore.
Okay.
So, Forrest, would you add it to your list?
Yes, I would add it to my list. For sure. And, I mean, there's a lot of reasons for that. But I will just name off the reasons I would add this to my list. First of all, I think the characters are all incredible. I think the world building is incredible. I think, like, pacing-wise, I do think it is pretty outstanding. I know Jack said that it goes really fast at certain points, and I would agree, but I also don't feel like that's to its detriment, really, because I don't think it needs to linger on a lot of the things that it goes past. The ending, definitely, there is a lot of exposition that has to be had, but I also feel like we learned pretty much everything we needed to learn. And then, I mean, animation wise, dude, we literally didn't even touch on that. I think this show is like one of the best pieces of animation I've ever watched.
It is visually gorgeous.
Like, it definitely had a huge budget, and I don't think there's a single episode that doesn't have at least one piece of outstanding animation.
I think part of that's because it is so stylized that it keeps true to itself. Like, there are some very violent moments that are depicted in the relatively cartoony, cutesy style that really hit harder because they do just come out of nowhere. It's like, wow, this is a cute show. Oh my God.
Yeah, well, and it's interesting that you keep talking about how cute it is, because, like, honestly, it is, but I never felt like it was that tonally dissonant. Like, I felt like Angel Beats was significantly more tonally dissonant than this.
Angel Beats was tonally dissonant in the plot point, and this show is too at points. But
I don't know.
I feel like the animation was, because it was going for like just a generic, this is what anime look like setup. It was just like, yeah, this is anime. They're shooting people. They're exploiting people. This show is soft edges, soft colors, some line work that's very inducive to just like making you feel nice. We watch feet get torn off. We watch like so much messed up stuff that, like, because it's depicted in this like very soft style, hit harder because it is disarming to watch such. And I'm saying that this is to the show's benefit.
Yeah,
I'm saying this is enough. Like, the animation is one of the reasons why you should watch this show.
Okay, but
so
anyway, I would definitely add it to my list.
There we go.
And I guess from here on out, we will just be talking about hard spoilers.
Yes, 100%. I cannot.
Because, yeah.
Specifically because, listener at home, I'm not talking to you anymore. Forrest and I are at two extremes to the point where, in order to explain my position to Forrest, I need to explain why. Spoiler territory. No holds barred. I think this show is worth watching, and I enjoy it a lot. I enjoy this show more than I've enjoyed a lot of anime recently, but for radically different reasons, I feel. The reason why I feel like this show doesn't explain enough is so many of the plot points feel like they're trying to be subversive. Like, King Boss dies in like episode 3. He before that had named Boji as king. The Big Four, which are the named retainers. Dorsh's best boy. I love him.
Dude, I love all 4 of the Big Four.
3 of them. One of them doesn't matter.
I disagree.
One of them is a very cool subversion. No, actually, 2 of them are a very cool subversion, and one of them's Dorsh, who's the best character in anime.
Dorsh is definitely like my favorite character.
Dorsh. But so the Big Four and the Queen and some people who we see twice have a vote about whether or not they should honor Boss's wishes and name Boji king, or if they should give it to Daida. On a 2-5, they vote to give it to Daida. Which, like, sets... And, like, this is back when the show is being a, like, political intrigue. There are some supernatural elements insofar as Boss is literally a giant, and we at this point know that there's an evil mirror. But it's very much like a fantasy show. Very Game of Thrones vibe in a very wholesome animation style. So this is where it's like starting to get subversive. This is where it's like, oh, this is like a political intrigue show. And then the next couple of episodes, Boji goes, I'm going to go have an adventure. I'm going to go become strong. I'm going to be trained enough to be recognized as the king because I want to be the king. We don't know why he wants to be the king. It's never really explained. At the end, it's sort of circumvented. I did not like the ending. We will talk about the ending when we get there.
I mean, can I interject about Boji going on his trip?
Yeah,
because I think that Boji going on the trip was perfectly fine.
Yes, 100%. That's not what I'm saying is bad.
No, I know. But I don't think that Boji necessarily wanted to be king. And that's very evident at the end. But, like, I do think that the only reason he went on that journey was because no one believed in him. You know, when he didn't become king, that was the thing that made him feel like, oh, these people don't believe I'm capable of things. And then there's a whole sequence where he like tries to just run off, but then like Killing stops him and like keeps him around. And then she finally is like, okay, you can go on your adventure, but these two guys have to go with you. And then, you know, that's kind of, I feel like that is kind of the motivating factor for then a lot of stuff to happen at the castle that I also think is really good. But yeah, anyway, I think that him wanting to be king isn't necessarily a thing. I think that Boji is a very complex character.
This is where the concept of Boji speaking through a translated Kage does the show a disservice. Is we don't know what Boji wants. We know what Kage is telling us that Boji wants, and Kage tells us early that Boji wants to be king. And maybe Boji at that time is telling Kage that he wants to be king because he doesn't know what he wants. But then by the end, Boji obviously decides, or from the get-go, always wanted something different.
It specifically doesn't tell us what Boji wants, I think, because of the ending. And I think it is a story about learning what Boji wants.
And I think that makes it worse. I don't even know if I feel like it's a story. Like, I don't feel... Okay, so the ending. Before we explain how we get there, the ending is Boji does it. It's an anime. The main character succeeds. Boji does it. He becomes king. He's done the training. There's a lot of really interesting and good stuff that happens along the way. But Boji does it. He becomes king. Kage leaves. And it is established early that Kage is like the core friend tenet thing that allows Boji to feel confident. But it is always in the pursuit of becoming king. Boji becomes king. Kage leaves because he feels like he cannot be there for Boji in a way that a king should have somebody there for them.
Which I think is absurd. And
it's very dumb and it comes out of nowhere.
Well, yeah, but Kage realizes that, you know. I think that the point of that moment for Kage was specifically for him to come to that realization, you know. And I genuinely don't think that Boji wanted to be king, but I think Boji was okay with being king as long as Kage was there by his side. And so Kage leaving was the motivating factor for Boji deciding, oh, I don't want to be king because I can't be with the one person who cared for me from the get-go.
Speaking of, after Boji becomes king and Kage leaves, Boji gives up being king because he wants to go find Kage. So this is one of those things that the art style is the only reason why this can happen. People blush when they are angry, when they are horny, when they are concerned. People blush, and it is the same blush animation style. So all of the time that Kage and Boji are blushing to each other, at first I was like, oh, are they like going to have a romance? And then it's like, oh no, this is just what they do when they're embarrassed. And then other characters who aren't romantically involved also blush at each other when they're embarrassed or when they're angry or like all these other emotions. And then everybody's blushing at everybody. So at the end, when Kage means enough to Boji for Boji to have given up the throne because I guess the throne was never what was there, I didn't see it coming, and I don't feel like it was established ever, because the only things that we've ever heard out of Boji through Kage was about the establishment of being the king. And yes, there is some implication that it's about the recognition of being valid and being helpful and being someone that others can rely on. And yes, there are some implications that Kage's support means more to Boji than other people's support, but never is it established or hinted at, I feel, that Kage's support is so important to Boji that Boji realized in the adventure that it is what he wanted. And it makes the scene where he goes to find Kage feel bad.
Yeah, I just don't feel that way. And I mean, I think I kind of explained why, but I think we should probably go back in time because we kind of just skipped to the ending.
Do we want to disagree about the big four?
I mean,
That's a fun place to go next.
We could start with Dorche, who we both agree on is amazing.
I was reading through my notes, and I have a page. So Dorsch is the shield of the queen. So the big four are like the most important, most powerful retinue of King Boss. Dorsch's job was to be the personal guard to Queen Hilling because Boji's mom got murked. Find out it's because of the mirror. The mirror is really, in a lot of ways, the main character after like episode 6, and I don't like it. We'll get to that.
I wouldn't say that.
We'll get to that point. But so Dorsch doesn't romantically love the queen. Maybe after Boss is dead, they start porking. That's not established in the anime. I could see it going that way. We don't really know because everybody shows everything from romantic interest to embarrassment through blushing. So it's a little bit harder to
It's interesting
tell.
that you have such a problem with that because I definitely never even contemplated that.
It is unclear because this is a show where people are not honest with each other. And so we can't go off of their dialogue, and so we have to go off of their like body language and like things like blushing. But what blushing means in this show is wider, and therefore it is less useful as a tool to discern character motivation. That is my thing about it. Anyway.
I feel like there's so much that is not told to us, but that is just simply shown that I almost feel like the characters like specifically telling us or us specifically learning why they do things isn't necessary.
Although we learn why people do things.
I mean, we do, but only when it's necessary. And I think that like the whole blushing thing just kind of... I never feel like the show gets that horny. And I feel like
I also don't think that it's a horny thing.
Yeah,
most
and
of
I
the
think
time.
that the blushing works really well because, like, I feel like the expressions on the characters' faces are good enough to specifically indicate what emotion they're feeling.
Whereas I think it's always just the same open-mouthed smile for most of them whenever they're blushing. Hilling is the only person who has a different blush. Hilling has a let's shade her face red to indicate that she's angry. Yeah. She's the only one that has a quote-unquote blush that's different.
Okay.
But
let's talk about Dorsch.
Dorsch. Anyway, we don't know if he and Hilling bang after the anime. I would like to believe that they do. Because I do kind of get vibes
What, you're
out
shipping them now?
Yes, because Hilling deserves somebody who cares about her. Also because I feel like Dorsch low-key gives me vibes that like he's here for it. Because he respects her a lot. So Dorsch is, as we were saying like 8 minutes ago, Dorsch is the shield of the queen, which means he was removed from being the spear of the king. So he was like removed from like an active combat offensive role to being a defensive role to protect Queen Hilling, and he didn't know why. There's this background episode flashback where he's talking about, does this mean that the king's lost faith in me? What's going on here? And Boss basically goes, no, I just want the queen to be safe. Oh, by the way, Dorsch, do you think the queen is worth protecting?
Well, but they also specifically say that it's an honor, you know. I mean, it's largely about, you know, Dorsch thinking that King Boss doesn't believe in his strength anymore, but then they're also like, but you're strong enough that, like, you're the person that I want protecting the queen.
Right, but then there's also like whether or not it is a matter of honor, and that's like the big like point that we establish in the background is we learn where Dorsch's loyalty lie because we learn what he discovered about himself with his assignment to being the queen's shield. Yeah. And what that is that he believes in Queen Hilling and who she is as a person enough that believe that she's worth protecting and that she's worth dying for. Now, we don't know if that's one of those they're going go get it, or if it's like a legitimate I respect you as a person Again, the only reason why I guess I didn't bring it up in this episode, but the only reason why I'm bringing it up is in anime, a lot of times those two things are not different. A lot of times people only respect the characters that they're having sex with.
But this show does a much better job of like not doing that.
I would agree, except for one very egregious moment at the end, which throws my entire understanding of the show into question. We'll get to that.
I mean, yeah.
There is one scene that undermined my understanding of everybody's physical body language because of how random it was. And that's why blushing makes me confused. Anyway, Dorsch is awesome. Dorsch is just a real big, strong, thick boy. He is a box. If he is 6 feet tall, he is 5 feet wide.
His fights were so good, dude.
Were so good.
That was like the best fights in this show. Like him against those like giant cat dog monsters in the hallway with the shields, dude.
Yeah.
Like that was so dope. Also animated incredibly well.
Yes, very well. But they're also so violent that the softer animation style really drove home how violent they were. Because it's like, oh, this is a really soft, like, children's TV Y7 show. As far as the animation's concerned, it's like, oh my god, they just bit his eye out. What? And I think that was very well done. And it's to the show's credit that that's, like, something that happens.
I also really respect shows that are willing to give characters permanent body changes through fights, because there's so much stuff that just like refuses to do that. But then like when a piece of fiction like puts a character through combat and has them come out the other end with like visible character changes, it makes those encounters and those conflicts feel that much more real, you know?
I agree in general, but I disagree in the instance of this show, because this show does not respect death in any way, shape, or form, to the point where the fact that people get scarred doesn't make sense to me. Dorsch dies like twice. Dorsch,
I mean, he doesn't die entirely.
Dorsch gives his life in any other context, in any other show, he is dead. Twice defending the queen, but the queen is from the Light Clan, who can just heal people.
And I would argue that that's actually utilized really well, because it's not like an infinite thing. Like she clearly, like, it is overutilized perhaps, but it is never, I don't feel like it is ever utilized in a way that ruins tension.
I think it undermines the hell out of tension.
I just, if it had been like used like constantly, like, I don't know, perhaps some characters should have died, but I guess I really like overlooked it because I didn't feel like it undermined the tension. And I mean, clearly, you know, that's just something that changes depending on the viewer, but
the reason why I think it matters whether or not people die is all of the combat, with the exception of scenes that include Boji, because Boji's hero's journey includes learning how to fight in a way that doesn't kill people, because he's a good boy and gets upset when things die. So with the exception of fights that include Boji, everybody's trying to kill each other. And we believe that's on the table for a lot of the show until people start getting healed. And then nobody dies from that point onward. Once healing is introduced and established as something that is readily available in this show, not a single character dies. Except for Boss, because Boss died of, like, old age, bleeding lung. Generic fantasy sickness.
I couldn't tell. I mean, I feel like it's not that important, but I do think that it was indicative of like Boss's strength. Like it might have been a side effect of him becoming like the strongest thing that's ever lived, essentially, is that like his body deteriorated faster. I don't know. That was just something that wasn't explained, and I don't think it needed to be. But
yeah, he needed to die for the plot to exist at all, so he can die.
But we should, since we both love Dorche, we should move on to another one of those.
No, we shouldn't.
Why?
Because I want to point out we can. In reality, we can. But I want to read a page of my notes. Background on Dida and the mirror. Some more information about the mirror. Shake off power that comes with malice. Nobles wear diaper pants. That's a visual aspect that I forgot that I hated, but now that I think about it.
What, the poofy shorts?
The poofy shorts. Everybody who wears shorts wears poofy shorts.
Well, it was just a very like stereotypical fantasy.
It's a strangely comedy aspect visually, again, to a show that's so dark. And then, 3 times larger than anything else on the page is, fuck yeah, Dorsch. Oh, Dorsch deserved better. Fuck yeah, Captain Guard. And then, for the half of the page, fuck yeah, Dorsch. The next page...
There was all your swearing for the episode.
Yes, it is. And then the next page is just fuck yeah, Dorsch. Because Dorsch has the most badass fight scene. It is Dorsch on death's door, and he just pure strong mans his way through it in order to protect the queen. And that scene only has dramatic tension if death is readily available for him. And when we think he dies, that's an incredibly powerful scene where it's like, wow, this was a dude that we learned everything that we know about him in the past, like, 30 minutes of show, and yet we feel deeply for him, and his conviction helps us establish any type of feeling with Hilling, because up until this point, we don't know that much about Hilling. We don't really care about her. So he lends her credibility. We then learn stuff about her, and she turns out to be a very good character. I enjoy her quite a bit by her own merit. But at the time, we care about her because Dorsch cares about her. And he gives his life defending her from these 3, like, demon goat dog things. Except, after he killed them, apparently when he was on death's door, she used her healing magic to heal him. And then he's just fine. And then later, he's defending her again with some other characters that don't matter. And there's more dogs, and they tear his foot off. Which is really gory. And is really shocking, again, because of how cutesy the animation is. And then he just, like, ties a coat or something to the stump.
Yeah, I was confused about that because he kind of still like had enough length to walk on it properly, even though he didn't have a peg leg yet.
He tied something to where his foot used to be, enough to let him walk around, and it would be one thing if he was in like a medical bay and like you could argue he took like a crutch or something, but he was in a field, like he was in a courtyard. So either homie tied a cinder block that he previously had wrapped up in like some type of fur to his leg, or he's just stepping on like fur. It's very strange.
Yeah. I mean, going back to the healing thing, I kind of got over it pretty quick. Maybe just because I'm desensitized, because One Piece refuses to kill any of its characters. But I was just kind of like, okay, I know this healing magic exists. Clearly the author didn't want to kill any of these characters, so I'm okay with it. I still felt the tension personally, but to each their own.
My thing, I suppose, is conflict cannot be based around violence if violence doesn't have a consequence.
But that's why they keep the scars. That's kind of how I felt about it. Because I love scars on characters, and I love the fact that, like, they kept their injuries, you know, because sometimes that just doesn't happen. Like, when a character should be fucking scarred to hell, they're not.
I mean, yeah, and that's more obnoxious, but the scars don't play a meaningful part. There's never a point where because Dorsch has one eye, he messes something up because he doesn't have depth perception anymore. Dorsch ties a rock to his stub,
well, that's
and now
that's an
he's
amount
just
of
Dorsch
depth
again.
That I guess I just wasn't expecting.
You see, for me, either something has consequences or it doesn't, and it feels like no physical confrontation in this show has consequences. Which wouldn't matter if the show didn't establish itself as a fighting show.
On that front, we should probably talk about Bebin. Well, yeah, but I think we can talk about Bebin because he's a similar situation where a piece like kills him really early on, and you're like, oh, is he just out of the game for good? But then you see his body get like pulled underground by his snakes, and then like so this guy controls snakes, or he doesn't control snakes, but he's best friends with a giant snake that controls a bunch of snakes.
So Dorsh, Doma, Atreus,
a piece,
and Bebin are the big four. They're the four main retainers. Bebin is you look at him and you're like, that dude's evil. He controls snakes. He's sort of the spy master. In episode 1, in episode 2, I suppose, he's introduced as younger brother, set up to be like an evil Joffrey character, Prince Daida's retainer. That's what we see of him. Apis is the spear of the king. He's just sort of quiet and cool and badass up until like episode 9, and then we learn stuff about him.
I loved Apis. I don't know. The moment that made me just love Apis was the fact that he like stood up for Boji, because like I loved how complex his character was. I do think it was a little lackluster in terms of like giving us his motivations for why he helps Moranjo out for so long, which is something we can talk about when he gets
Moranjo is the name of the mirror.
But on the topic of Bebin, I liked him. I guess thinking about it now, I don't think he has nearly as much depth, but he just does a lot of things to help out. And, early on, you definitely are kind of trying to figure out what his deal is. Like, is he really for Daida? But then you kind of get the vibes that he's for Boji. And
you see, I disagree. I think Bebin is the deepest of all of the big four because we don't know for the longest amount of time where his loyalty lies. For like the first half of the show, we just think that he's evil. He does evil things, but then we find out that he's on Boji's side all along, and that reveal is huge.
Oh yeah, no, I mean it's really good. I guess I'm just saying he doesn't have nearly as much like complexity going on.
He doesn't have as much screen time, but I think his motivations are more complex. Okay. His motivations is he is loyal to the crown. He wants what's best for the kingdom, and what's best for the kingdom is to adhere to Boji becoming king. It was boss's wishes. It doesn't not make sense. So he's doing what he can in his capacity as kind of a spy master to help Boji become the king. We find that out very slowly, and that reveal is awesome. But that loyalty to like that idea of stability and that idea of what should happen is so much more complex to me than a pieces, which is, oh my God, this woman made me believe in myself. Now I'm going to do everything that she wants me to, up to and including betraying the king. I think simping for a magic woman who ends up being trapped in a mirror is much less complex than I'm going to do nefarious things to achieve the good of the realm.
Yeah, I mean, I think that with a piece, you do get those moments where you see kind of like how, I don't remember if we see like how Moranjo saved him, because it seemed like the insinuation was that she kind of like gave him a purpose to his life. And then like that was kind of the reason why he was so dedicated to her after that point. It was weird how dedicated he was to her, but I also feel like they do a good enough job of showing us his struggles in like, helping her out, helping her bring a bunch of terrible people to the castle and like kind of being part of the plot to kill Queen Hyling, like that's just a whole nother part of the story. But him doing that there's that really good moment, I think, when they're like standing on the bridge and, he's like, I can't do this anymore. Like, I have to help them. And then she's like, oh, so you're just going to betray me now? I mean, that moment was okay, but I do think that a piece gets a chance to kind of not 100% redeem himself, but I don't think he's that bad of a character.
Okay, so for context about the scene that Forrest was just talking about, after she was unable to kill... Okay. Moranjo is a woman from a kingdom of mages that got set up by this other kingdom that they turned to for help. And then and this is like one of the 2 instances of child abuse, trigger warning, she gets absolutely brutalized by the kingdom.
Like, she just gets disfigured.
Like, they peel off her face skin. Thankfully, we don't have to watch it, but it's established that her face gets skinned and her hands get cut off, and all of these other very terrible things happen to her. Because the kingdom that her kingdom of mages went to for help, when things started turning poorly, turned on them and set them up as a scapegoat. So, Boss watched basically that whole situation go down and is like, this person has suffered so much. My life is now helping them not suffer anymore. This then establishes what I think is a very poorly established plot point between Boss and Moranjo, basically creating all of the conflict in the series. I don't like that. But Moranjo, for who knows how long, was the assistant to King Boss. She sets up how Boss becomes the strongest man in the world, which is by trading all of the strength of his son to a demon to get that much strength himself. Well, Boss doesn't have a son yet. So the demon goes, don't worry about it, I'll take it from your unborn son. And that unborn son turns out to be Boji. That's why Boji's so weak. That's why Boji can't hear or speak. He's demon cursed because his dad's not a good dude. So Moranjo, in her capacity helping King Boss throughout his reign, we're seeing helps a piece become stronger. And I guess what was keeping him weak is the fact that he didn't believe in himself. She's having him fight these... King Boss brings a piece down to the underworld, or the gate to the underworld, so that Moranjo can have him fight these frozen monsters. And a piece is about to die, I guess because he's not confident in himself. It doesn't really scan, in my opinion, because we just sort of watch him be not as strong as a griffin, which, fair enough, a piece, that's a griffin. And then she calls off the griffin and goes, hey, believe in yourself. And then that's how he became strong enough to be one of the big four.
Yeah, I mean, that is one of the weaker aspects of the writing, for sure. I don't know, is there anything else to say about a piece, really?
I mean, that's pretty much all that we get in terms of his backstory. And from that day forward, he was loyal to Moranjo. He wasn't loyal to the crown. He was loyal to Moranjo. And that's why... So, for the first half of the series, we don't know what he's doing, because he doesn't really speak, until he makes his way down to the underworld, where Moranjo and a couple of, like, weird clown gimps, who are some of the most interesting visual design. They're not people, they're dolls that Moranjo is puppeting magically, are trying to force the newly crowned King Daida into drinking a resurrection potion for Boss. Which is another example of where the show's just really gruesome. The frozen corpse of Boss gets ground into like an energy drink in this giant human food processor, and then that energy drink is put in a sphere in like this chamber of mirrors and gets cooked by the sun into a phoenix egg, And then the Phoenix gets decapitated?
Yeah, that was a very complex spell.
It was very gruesome. And, like, the blood from the neck of the Phoenix gets, like, put into a goblet, and then the ashes get compressed into a diamond, and then that gets force-fed to Daida, because a piece is like, oh my god, Miranja, what are you doing? I'm gonna help you. And so Boss reincarnates as Daida because Miranjo's doing it to help him, but he's only doing what he's doing to help Miranjo be happy, and he thinks Miranjo is only happy with him. Their entire dynamic is poorly established, I feel.
Miranjo and Boss?
Yes. Their motivations for being loyal to each other is solid. Boss felt terribly for Miranjo, and Miranjo grew attached to the only person who was kind to her after terrible tragedy. That makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is honestly something we can talk about when we talk about the end of the show.
The end of the show.
Because their relationship is very integral to kind of just the worst decision in the show. But we should finish talking about the big four.
Dorsh's best boy. A piece
is fine.
Is fine. I feel poorly motivated.
And then Domas.
Domas has the coolest moment when I feel the show is at its strongest. I guess to summarize Bebin, because we touched on him, he looks evil, but turns out he's on Boji's side. That's more or less all there is that you need to know. Domas is handsome Lancelot-style boy. He was assigned specifically by King Boss to be Boji's sword trainer. And we see him being very supportive of Boji, learning sign language for Boji. But he does not vote for Boji to be king. He feels like Daida will do a better job, and it's in the best interest of the kingdom to vote for Daida to become king. So, starting from that moment, we don't know where his loyalties lie. Well, he's one of the two people that Hillings send off with Boji to do his adventure to get stronger. Boji just wants an adventure. He wants to get out and go do something. Hillings like, okay, cool, go send this letter to my parents in this other kingdom. They then turn it into an adventure about getting Boji stronger, because that's what Boji wants to do, and Kage was assigned by Bebing in secret to do that. It's a lot. We see Domas just being a good boy, a really supportive boy. And then he's like, hey, Boji, let's go look at the gateway to the underworld, which is like this fissure that has like this like Old Faithful style, like flame lava eruption. And Domas, without any previous setup, pushes Boji into the fissure.
Yeah.
In the most beautiful moment. It's so Game of Thrones. It's the most egregious betrayal. You feel how hurt and confused Boji is in that moment. And just the cold, dead inside face of Domas as he's doing this. It's a beautiful moment. We find out later that Domas was told to do it by Daida, because Daida was encouraged to tell him to do it by Miranjo. Daida later regrets it, and Domas regrets it almost immediately after he pushes Boji and he starts crying because he's like, I did it, I did my duty. Oh God, Boji, forgive me. Very well done. Not followed up on.
What, his regret? Because, I mean, there's a whole moment.
Domas's regret is sort of the motivation for him becoming a comedy supporting character. Because after that point, basically, the only things that we see of him are him crying because he's upset with what he's done. But it's not like to progress character motivation. It's like comedically slamming his forehead to the ground because he's bowing in such apology, crying.
guess I didn't find that comedic personally.
I didn't find it funny, but the way that it was structured and the way that it was edited made it feel like it was done as like a comedy sequence, and things like that happen pretty much for the rest of his existence in the show.
My opinion on that whole situation is I think it's done really well because it's one of the first times that I've ever seen, I feel like, PTSD shown in a very believable manner, because since Boji literally, this man tried to murder him, any time Boji thinks about him, you get this very visceral reaction from Boji, thinking about what it would even be like to come face to face with this person again. And like even when it happens, Boji can't do it. He has to run away, and clearly Domas feels very distraught about it. But I mean, since this is a medieval setting, you're supposed to just assume like, yeah, these people are so dedicated and sworn to their kingdom that they will literally do anything their king tells them to do. And I think that he swears himself to Boji. He's like, there's nothing that I can do to make you forgive me, but he at least pledges his life to Boji once and for all. And the character Hokuro, who we haven't even touched on once, he's like one of the more one-note characters, but I think he is a huge motivational factor for why Domas becomes the person he does later on. Overall, I think Domas is a pretty solid character. And I mean, this is kind of like where the complexity of the characters for me comes in, because like these characters don't necessarily grow that much, I guess, from a character progression kind of concept. But I think that the way that the author specifically shows the emotional responses on these characters' faces, the way that like their thoughts and feelings are represented, I think is so incredibly well done. And you get to see so much without just blatantly being told. And I think that's a really hard thing to do.
I agree with like 90% of what you just said. The show very much does a good job of showing people feeling feelings. It's very communicative in that way. I also agree that Boji has a very real, very well depicted reaction to the concept of encountering Doma again, and when they encounter each other again, has a very real reaction. I feel like the show doesn't deliver on that, though, because you see that fear once, and then you see the actual interaction once in which Boji runs away. Fair enough, that's a fear response. 20 seconds later, Kage has him laughing because they're climbing the walls in a funny way. Boji's just over it.
I mean, I don't think
Boji's
Boji was necessarily over it.
He doesn't get that way again.
Well, yeah, but I mean, like, that was the moment that was supposed to, bring that whole thing full circle. Like, yeah, he doesn't have the same reaction, but I think it's believable to think that someone wouldn't have an identical reaction. He still doesn't want to face Domas,
He doesn't like Domas after that, but we never see him become uncomfortable with Domas after that.
Yeah.
Realistically, he didn't resolve his fear of him. He had an interaction with him, which he resolved by leaving, which is something that would reinforce the idea in his head that Domas is something to be feared. It is not a reaction that encourages him to reassociate Domas positively in his brain, but after that, Domas is part of the crew again.
Yeah, I mean, I think the story didn't really take the time, to do that, to like develop that aspect of Boji's character, because I feel like after that point, there was just so much going on that I definitely think it got pushed to the wayside.
Well, this is kind of what I was saying earlier about how I feel like the first handful of episodes were the best, because there wasn't that much that the show ran away with. We had intrigue, we had characters, and we had a grounded, if not fantastical, setting. as we start introducing more characters, it's a big ensemble by the end. And the show tries to make sure that everybody's in the last couple of episodes and that everybody has something to do. None of them really contribute as a result, though. Like, Desha, who is the person that Boji goes to train with.
That was Despa. Desha was the other king.
Desha was...
I mean, like, I think it's supposed to be confusing. But yeah, we haven't even touched on those characters.
King Desha is the king of the underworld. He's the second-ranked king when the show starts. How did he become ranked 1?
I mean, we don't even learn. And I think that that's specifically supposed to be something you're supposed to learn later on. Because, like, we don't even know who the ranked first king was. So, like... the fact that, like, at the end of the show they're like giving him that ranking clearly shows that something else happened while
Desha's interaction. Desha very much as a character is whatever the plot point of the last chapters of manga are. As far as the anime is concerned, he's left in the air in a pretty unsatisfying but not related to Boji's story way.
I didn't feel like it was necessarily unsatisfying, but I do feel like if we're talking about him, one of my favorite sequences in the series was their whole conflict in front of the gate to the underworld underneath the castle. That was like that's like one of the first times I've been watching something where I really noticed how well it utilized the space within which the story was happening, I guess, if that makes sense. Because this happens like in a room with a staircase that's like leading down, and Desho with his forces come from the underworld and they're going to try to invade the castle. And Domas and Hokuro are there. And then, you know, later on, Boji and Gigan and Kage show up. And I've just like I never really think about that as an aspect to a story. And that just like really made me think about it. Because the way that like the staircase is utilized as this like place for these characters to interact was so fascinating, especially with, you know, Domas and then Boji, and this is kind of our first chance to see how strong Boji has become, and it's like really, really cool.
Yeah, so Desha so Moranjo breaks a set of criminals out of the underworld and brings them back into Boss's kingdom in order to do some things that are poorly thought out, but motivated well enough. Because they were criminals of the underworld, Desha is using this as an excuse to basically go into the kingdom's capital, take back the criminals, and also, while he's there, take over that kingdom. However, the only location that they know of to get there is through this giant staircase. Well, we know that Moranjo's been using this portal made of the skin of the Shadow Clan that got destroyed. That's a minor plot point, but
I mean, yeah, I think that clearly feels like it's something meant for later down the line as well. You know, I think the author definitely drops little pieces here and there.
I will say that in particular felt pretty wrapped up. It felt like this is how Moranjo's been doing this. We've dealt with it. It's been destroyed.
But we also saw Kage kind of expand his body in a weird way that we had never seen before. And I definitely, I mean, like, it can be resolved, but I also feel like little tiny things like that feel like they're little just tidbits thrown out there by the author to give you something to think about. Because, like, if Kage's race becomes more important later down the line, those are things that we need to learn.
Yeah. So Kage's whole body thing isn't related necessarily to this. It is interesting, and we can talk about it in a moment.
I just thought it was interesting because of its visual representation to, or like similarities to the portal.
I guess I didn't see that much of it personally. But anyway, so the portal is how Miranda's been going in and out of the underworld. Apart from that, the only established point into Boss's capital, and therefore the kingdom, that Desha is trying to invade is that stairway that Forrest was talking about. That's where Domas is given his opportunity to make his redemption. He's felt guilty about his betrayal of Boji from the beginning. And so he is given this redemption mission to go destroy the portal to the underworld. Along the way, he runs into Desha and all of his forces. And him being, one of the big four, one of the best swordsmen in the land, he's making this heroic last stand. He's defeating all of these dudes. He's awesome. He's strong, which establishes how strong Desha is, because Desha shows up and just gacks him, basically. And then that's how we learn how strong Boji is. I do think the stairwell is done very well. The stairwell is used very well as a location and as a set piece. All that I was trying to bring up when mentioning the portal is why the stairway is important. The portal itself is an explanation of something, and then it gets resolved. I don't think it'll be important in the last chapters. I can be wrong, though.
I feel like this would be a good opportunity to kind of move on towards the end of the series. Because, we're already pretty far into the podcast.
I feel like this may be a good example of why 24-episode seasons might not work for this show.
I
feel like we've discussed maybe a tenth of what needs to be discussed.
Well, but also, how much do we need to discuss in this podcast?
I feel like our discussion of the finale isn't going to make a lot of sense.
I don't know if I agree with you, because we can literally just lead into it and give some more context as to why. Because I enjoyed the ending and Jack didn't, but we've pretty much touched on who Miranjo is. We've touched on who King Boss is. Literally all we have to talk about is King Boss and Miranjo's relationship and how vague that is, because then that pretty much leads right into a lot of the ending.
Miranjo made a deal with a demon. It's a demon that she made friends with as a child that then grew up to become a more demonic soul tradey demon. That's how Boss gets his power. We get a flashback of them living together, going around the world together, where Miranjo's trying to figure out how to help Boss because she feels indebted to him.
Well, it's also about him trying to make her happy, and once
in a way that only happens because neither of them are communicating with each other.
Yeah, it is odd, but I think the biggest issue with their relationship is it is never stated if they are lovers or if he views her as a daughter. They kind of just exist, and it's very, very odd.
Boss uses a phrase, and I don't think I wrote it down exactly because I was making the conscious decision to use less notes this episode. Boss uses a phrase when he's explaining this to Dida, similar to, she's like a wife and a mother and a daughter to me. What does that tell us, Boss? What does that mean?
Wait, when did he say that?
When he's showing Dida memories, because Boss took Dida's body, because Miranjo had Boss reincarnated into Dida's body because she was trying to give him the strongest, happiest kingdom in the world.
Except she wasn't, because she was also trying to destroy it.
She was trying to destroy it so that he could be happy because...
that whole motivation was very
poorly established.
Not well established. Because it's so you want to destroy this man's kingdom because all you want to do is go adventure with him again? I feel like you could literally just do that and leave his kingdom to someone else.
But she also thought that he would be happier if they reset things. It's not well established, and it is very heavy-handedly rushed into the last 3 episodes, which is part of the reason why I think the ending's bad.
The thing that I do think is well established is Miranjo and him both specifically discuss how they lost kind of touch with their emotions. You know, I do think while that might have not been lingered on as long as it could have been, that was used as their motivating factor, you know, because they both went through so much, and like King Boss became like the most powerful man on the planet. There's a specific scene where he defeats this person who he couldn't defeat before, and he's like, why don't I feel anything anymore? And I think the implication is that they both lost touch with who they were as people, that they just kind of started doing things. And Miranjo especially didn't feel anything when she started to like hurt people and, you know, cause pain, because her whole motivation for killing Queen Hyling was she didn't want Queen Hyling to feel pain. She was like, I took your son from you. I want you to just her motivation is basically, I just want to kill you because I don't want you to suffer anymore. It's those kind of motivations
that is a line that she says, but it's not something that like she says that to King Boss reincarnated as a way to convince him to be okay with murdering her, but she never says why she wants him to be murdering her, because at the time that she says it, we don't have any reason to trust her, and we don't really have any reason to trust her ever.
I'd agree, but the ending is largely about them coming to terms with that, you know, because we can continue to the ending, I think, because this is where shit just kind of hits the fan.
So what I would like to say, if I can have you like put a pin in that and have you not forget that, what Forrest is talking about when he says that they lost sight of like what they wanted, is both Miranjo and Boss, we learn independently from each other, had become disassociated and held on to the fact that the only thing they really remember feeling passionately about is making the other person happy. And they never discuss what either one of them wants, and so Miranjo's going full blast into making this dream about strength happen for Boss, but Boss is going full blast into Miranjo wants to do these things, so I'm going to support her. So Miranjo, in her plan to make Boss stronger, says, well, we need to kill Hyling because we need you to have Daida's body, and Hyling is going to get in the way and be upset if you are in King Daida, in Daida's body. And she basically throws in the she'll be upset part to help convince Boss to let his wife be murdered. And then Boss is like, okay, cool, I guess this is a thing that Miranjo wants to do, and I want Miranjo to be happy. It's a very weird dynamic. It's honestly kind of a cool example of codependency. It is a very real, like, yeah, they're not communicating and they're trying to please each other and losing themselves in the way. Yeah. And that's very cool. How it becomes established and the motivations behind it feel a little weak. But once you've accepted that dynamic, it's pretty cool.
I mean, they did go through a lot of incredibly traumatic things together. So I think that in and of itself is enough reason for their relationship. But that being said, at the end, you know, things are hitting the fan. Daida, there's a whole kind of subplot point with Daida's consciousness kind of being trapped within his body, and him, you know, kind of getting to witness all of these memories of Miranjo and Boss through Boss's own head, essentially. And those are very interesting moments, but it's like through that Daida kind of comes to, I guess, respect and care for Miranjo in a weird way, which I think is the perfect opportunity to lead into the worst part of the story, where after they kind of solve everything and Daida's consciousness gets reestablished in his own body, and King Boss gets sent on his way to basically the afterlife, King Daida decides to save Miranjo's life as well. And I don't think we necessarily have to go super in depth into like how that happens, because if you're going to watch the show, you'll learn. But then Daida is just like, I'm going to have Miranjo marry me. And I was like, why is that even something that is happening? First of all, we have no idea how old Miranjo is. We have no idea how old Daida is. We also have no idea if Miranjo and Boss were lovers, though it's kind of insinuated that they weren't. But anyway, it's still weird, and
but
it was
they
just
also
a
have
really
like a romantic waltz scene to imply that they do kind of have a lover relationship.
Yeah, it's just a very bad decision, and I think that ultimately they could have just accepted Miranjo into their family and been like, yes, we will care for her because she has been through way too much in her life. Instead, Daida's like, yeah, I'm going to make her my wife. And I'm just like, why?
So, I don't agree 1,000%, but this is a moment where whichever one of us is editing could have a very fun Predator handshake clap moment, because I also think this is the worst scene in the entire series. Miranjo gets redemption, not only motivation, and like, by the time this happens, you as an audience understands why she does what she did. And you see it, and it makes sense. But they really aggressively shoehorn in all of her exposition and all of her, like, relationship with Boss in the second to last episode. It's all flashback.
I don't feel like it was shoehorned in. We had to learn about it at some point. But I think that the show was banking on the mystery of it, and really the only time that it worked was in that second to last episode.
I just don't think it was necessary, but regardless of if you want to agree with the verbiage, it's jammed in the second to last episode, and then the last episode throws a twist at you for no good reason and sucks. We'll talk about that in a moment. But the Daida deciding to marry Miranjo thing makes so little sense, because he doesn't know who she is. When he meets her as a child, as a, like, 3-year-old. Because the version of her that he meets is the freshly disfigured 3-year-old in her own memories. That's the first Miranjo he meets. That's the Miranjo that he consoles. That's the Miranjo that he helps get some closure with. And then who knows how old Miranjo is at the time that Boji saves her from the demon that she sells her soul to. Miranjo sells her soul to a demon for Boss's sake. Boji saves her soul, and the soul of Boss goes look after her as he flutters away into a happy ending that he does not deserve. So Miranjo, who spent her entire life in service to this dude, for whatever motivation, as we've talked about, it's kind of hard to nail down what that motivation was, but she spends her entire life in motivation to this dude. She commits atrocities on his behalf. Over like the course of 2 episodes, she learns the error of her ways in a way that just doesn't feel earned, into my mind, and doesn't feel good. And she is still dealing with that. She's still having that realization when Daida goes, hey, Miranjo, be my wife. And she's like, okay, I'm here for this, even though not 2 minutes ago in character, I was in a weird will they, won't they with your dad.
But I kind of disagree. I feel like her redemption of sorts was earned, because the whole last 3 episodes was specifically delving into why she was doing what she was doing. And then you're not just supposed to, accept what she did or forgive her right in that moment, but the whole point,
the audience kind of are. The characters aren't.
But you don't have to. I'm saying her, them accepting her is largely because Boji doesn't want to kill people. And like Boji understands that she did a bunch of terrible stuff, but Boji also witnessed some very important aspects of her memories. And so like both Boji and Daida know what she went through, knew what like terrible stuff she did. And I mean, like, yeah, it is a little bit of a weird message because you're like, oh, this person who went through a lot of trauma committed atrocities, and now we should just accept that that was because they went through this trauma.
Everything's justifiable if their childhood's sad enough.
Yeah, exactly.
Is what gets hammered through.
I mean, like, yeah, that is a little fucked up. But I don't know. I didn't feel like the show did a bad job in like giving us the reasons for why they decided to accept her at the end. I don't know.
I understand why Boji decides to accept her, because Boji's a good boy who can't even let monsters die. Like objective monsters. Presented unredeemably monsters die. Why Daida accepts her as a bride.
Well, I mean, that's why it's bad, because that doesn't make any goddamn sense. But
if Daida just left it with, I forgive you, but I don't want to see you because you are literally directly responsible for the murder of thousands of my subjects.
But
that would be one thing.
He was also doing it because Boss asked him to. And I understand that Boss was complicit in everything that happened to Daida, but the whole purpose was that Daida understood what they both went through. And it was like Boss's dying wish that he do for Miranjo that Daida do for Miranjo what Boss couldn't do in the end.
That would be a more satisfying logic if they didn't end it in marriage.
Well, exactly. But that's what I'm saying. Like, the marriage part's not good, but I'm saying I think everything around it was good. I just think that one decision just kind of ruined that
I don't think Miranjo or Boss should have gotten redemption. I don't think we should have gotten the story behind Immortal Prince Boy. He's not really that important. He kills some people because Miranjo tells him to. He's also the third brother of Desha and Despa, who is Boji's master, who teaches Boji to be self-confident and gives him a rapier so that his speed can make up for his strength, basically. He's the third brother. They have, the three of them have a tragic backstory. But ultimately, Miranjo shouldn't have gotten redemption. Boss shouldn't have gotten redemption. Immortal evil guy shouldn't have been given a backstory.
That's
by
fine.
nature of having every character be forgivable and be forgiven, the entire thing feels like it didn't go anywhere to me. It would have felt earned if Boji stayed king. So Boji saves the day. Boji becomes king. Kage leaves thinking that he's not worthy to be Boji's friend now that Boji is king. He's not worthy to be the king of the friend of a king. Boji is sad as king because Kage's not there. So Boji gives up being king to go find Kage.
I mean, but that's only after Hyling specifically is like, you don't have to be king, you know. I think that Boji felt obligation to it, but, you know, the people around him still supported him, and in the end, the people around him told him it was okay for him to not be king.
Which is something we get in the last 3 minutes.
I mean, but it's still
we
done
get that
well.
I disagree. Whole cloth.
I think that speech from Hyling was plenty.
Hyling basically goes, hey, you seem unhappy. A good king is responsible for the happiness of everyone in his kingdom. That means you too. Okay, cool. Well, I guess Kage means more to Boji than literally anything else, which isn't a good dynamic to establish because that makes Boji woefully unilaterally dependent on Kage and Kage's approval. That's pretty messed.
I don't think that that's the case at all.
It's the reality of it. If the reality of it is that he is in a position to help literally everybody in the world and he gives it up because he's not literally in direct contact with Kage, Boji's entire sense of self is rooted in Kage at that point. Also, Kage leaving is so ham-fistedly shoved into like the last 10 minutes, and we don't get any hints prior to him doing his leave that he was planning on leaving or that he felt unworthy. Like, he had spent the entire series up until this point going, if I can make myself valuable to Boji, then I have value. And then Boji becomes king and he goes, I'm not valuable enough to stand behind Boji now. Which doesn't make sense because if your value is rooted in your usefulness to Boji, your usefulness to Boji hasn't changed.
Yeah, I kind of just disagree mostly because I think that it doesn't prove Boji's codependence on Kage. I genuinely, I mean, parts of it feel like they're just because the story needs to continue, because this isn't the end of Boji's story. But also, Kage and Boji specifically have a discussion about how Boji decides he wants to start his own kingdom. And I think that's because, not necessarily because Boji is codependent on Kage, but because Boji realized that he couldn't really be who he wanted to be as king of that country. I don't know. I almost took it as Boji wants to create a place where Kage can also feel accepted, you know?
Maybe. And yeah, that conversation does happen. It's like literally the last conversation of the series, but like at no point prior to that did Kage give the indication that within the context of the castle, with the other retainers, with Hilling, did he feel unaccepted? At the beginning, when they're like, oh, hey, aren't you from that clan of assassins? What are you doing here? Okay, fair enough. But by episode 4, he's been tasked with protecting Boji, which means he's accepted, right? Like, his feeling of unworthiness is not established and not shown and not earned even, because objectively, there are multiple times where he acknowledges that he himself is what is the person who motivated Boji to keep going. And he's told by Despa, the master, you need to keep motivating Boji. Boji draws a lot from you. Kage isn't shown by anybody that he's unworthy after he's established part of the crew.
Oh, I get that. It felt like that whole point was literally just to show that Kage still had insecurities, because they show that one scene where he's like going around and trying to find a job, and he's convincing himself. He's like, I can do this. I'm just going to be on my own. But I think the idea was, you can argue that it was a pointless scene. You can argue that all of this was pointless, but ultimately I just felt like it was meant to show that Kage still had insecurities to work on, you know?
Yeah. And I just feel like he could have insecurities back at the kingdom. Like,
but I mean, that's also why Boji went to find him.
Okay, yeah, but Boji can also send out his network of spy snakes, find him, and then bring him back to Boss's kingdom, because Boji's the king. He can create a kingdom that accepts Kage.
No, I get it. Yeah, I mean, I'm not like, oh my god, I love it, but I do think there were plenty of reasons for why it went the way it did. And I think ultimately it was just their way of being like, the story continues, even if it was done well or not. But
it is very much, and there is more to this story.
Yeah.
It is, I will die on the hill that is done poorly.
That's totally fine. But I mean, I guess that's pretty much the end of the series.
So I guess to summarize, if you've stuck it out this long, / we can salvage a listenable podcast from how we've just gone off.
I think we will.
To summarize, it's a great show. I would watch it. The last 4 episodes suck ass.
I don't think they suck ass, but it is an amazing show. You should definitely watch it.
Suck ass.
That was a fantastic sentence, and I appreciate it.
But yeah, my name is Forrest, and this is Jack.
And I don't do social media, but Forrest, you have something.
Yeah, I make music. You can find me at Boostello on Bandcamp or Spotify or YouTube. And you can also find my other projects. My other one is called Prism Ship. Yeah, thanks for listening.
Goodbye.